open this public hearing of the Human Rights Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade in Canberra. These are public proceedings and we welcome all those who are watching the proceedings online. Throughout the 46th Parliament, the Human Rights Subcommittee, through a series of private briefings, has sought to keep itself abreast of human rights violations affecting various communities. The subcommittee has convened this roundtable to discuss current human rights abuse issues with members of various Ethiopian diasporas in Australia. Before we move to opening statements and discussion, I need to advise of some formalities. I remind witnesses that giving evidence to a committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated as a contempt of the Parliament. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. In accordance with the committee's resolution at the start of the 46th Parliament, this hearing is being broadcast on the Parliament's website, and proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website in due course. Those present or listening to the proceedings are reminded that recording is permitted and that there is a requirement to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. I remind all witnesses that to assist the orderly conduct of this teleconference, I'll coordinate proceedings and will invite comments as we go along. It will therefore be sensible to hear from each group in turn. If there are questions which arise during the course of proceedings, please wait until your comments are invited. And I remind everyone that interjections are unhelpful. Mobile phones should be switched off or turned to silent. To assist Hansard in providing an accurate record of proceedings, members of the committee and witnesses should identify themselves before they speak. We'll begin today's proceedings by hearing from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and Tigrayan diaspora groups. I ask witnesses to identify themselves by name and position only at this stage, perhaps starting with Amnesty International.
Nikita White, campaigner at Amnesty International Australia.
Right. Human Rights Watch.
Yep, Elaine Pearson, Australia Director at Human Rights Watch.
The Australia Tigray Alliance.
Rubai Tessema, Australia Tigray, with a few of my colleagues as well.
Is Dr. Mason.
Yes, Dr. Deborah Mayerson from University of New South Wales, Canberra, at the Australian Defence Force Academy.
Ms. Burhane. Ms. Yanu.
Yep, Matut, yeah.
Mr. Nega. No. And then representatives of the Alliance of Tigrayan Community Associations in Australia and New Zealand, Dr. Maru.
Here.
Dr. Hailu. And Ms. Solomon. No, that's right. Can I indicate that I am joined in the room at Parliament House by the Deputy Chair, Mr. Hayes, and by Senator Rice, and we are also joined online by Mr. Hill as well. It's stuck in whilst I was looking down. And we're joined online by Senator Fawcett and Ms. Van Vakenu. So there's 5 members of the committee here. I'll invite some opening statements. If you could keep them to about 5 minutes, that would be good, because we've got a relatively confined period of time. So I'll go back in the same order. Ms. White from Amnesty International.
Thank you for giving Amnesty the opportunity to present today. Since November 4th, 2020, Ethiopian forces, Eritrean forces, and Amhara militias have been in conflict with Tigrayan forces, including the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, and Tigrayan militias. In August 2021, the TPLF joined forces with the Oromo Liberation Army, or OLA. Since the conflict began, thousands of civilians have been killed, hundreds of thousands have been displaced, and Amnesty International has documented human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law, including war crimes and abuses that may amount to crimes against humanity. These abuses include the massacre of hundreds of civilians in Oxum, alongside extrajudicial executions, looting, and indiscriminate shelling by Ethiopian forces, Eritrean forces, and Amhara forces in November 2020. Eritrean forces also massacred hundreds of unarmed civilians in Oxum in February 2021. Both these massacres may amount to crimes against humanity. The conflict has also been marked by the use of gender-based and sexual violence. It is clear that sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war to inflict lasting physical and psychological damage on women and girls in Tigray. We have documented sexual violence by Ethiopian forces, Eritrean forces, and Amhara militia groups. Many of the survivors of sexual violence we spoke to also witnessed the rape of other women, and our research indicates that sexual violence is widespread and is explicitly intended to brutalize, humiliate, degrade, and dehumanize women in Tigray. One survivor Amnesty interviewed for our research told us, "I don't know if they realized I was pregnant. I don't know if they realized I was a person." Other women interviewed by Amnesty said they were held captive for days or weeks and subject to sexual slavery by Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers who sought to humiliate these Tigrayan women using ethnic slurs, insults, threats, and other degrading comments. Survivors of sexual violence have had difficulties accessing healthcare and support services in both internally displaced persons camps in Ethiopia and refugee camps in Sudan. We've also released research today documenting the rape of women in Amhara, as well as the looting of homes by the TPLF in August 2021. Throughout the conflict, the Ethiopian government has hindered humanitarian access into Tigray, including healthcare and desperately needed food for millions of people. 400,000 people in Tigray are currently in famine-like conditions. And in recent months, the conflict has bled outside the borders of Tigray, as have human rights abuses, alongside a horrifying rise in speech advocating for ethnic violence in response to a TPLF offensive into the Amhara and Afar regions. In Addis Ababa, Amnesty has documented the mass arrests and arbitrary detentions of Tigrayans, including journalists and human rights activists, who the government has claimed without due process have ties to the TPLF. Former detainees told Amnesty that police stations were full of people speaking Tigrinya. On the anniversary of the conflict, the Ethiopian government adopted a sweeping set of emergency powers. These powers allow authorities to arrest anyone without a warrant if there is a reasonable suspicion of cooperation with terrorist groups, and the TPLF is designated as a terrorist group, and to detain them without judicial review for as long as the emergency powers are in place, which is currently for 6 months. Amnesty has significant concerns that these powers will lead to the arbitrary arrest of Tigrayans, human rights defenders, and journalists, and that those arrested and detained will be at risk of torture and other ill treatment. There are reports that at least 16 Tigrayan United Nations employees have been detained in the last week under the emergency powers. There has also been an alarming rise in social media posts advocating ethnic violence against Tigrayans. And as always, social media platforms are too slow to remove these posts. Government officials have also called in recent days for civilians to take up arms against the TPLF and the OLA. Today, Ethiopia is teetering on the brink of a human rights and humanitarian catastrophe, and the international community, including Australia, needs to act immediately, call for Ethiopia to step back from the brink, to end incitement against ethnic groups, to amend the emergency powers so that they respect human rights, and allow the unfettered access to northern Ethiopia for humanitarian organizations and human rights monitors. Australia must continue to condemn human rights abuses and war crimes that are committed during the conflict, and to call for accountability and justice for survivors of these violations, including sexual and gender-based violence. We must fund support services for the survivors of sexual violence, and we also ask that the government calls on the United Nations Secretary General to urgently send his team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict to Tigray. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms White. Ms Pearson?
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us a chance today to share our concerns about the current crisis in Ethiopia. It is 1 year since the outbreak of conflict in Tigray in November 2020. The Ethiopian government and allied forces, Eritrean and Amhara forces, have massacred and forcibly displaced civilians, carried out brutal attacks of sexual violence, destroyed and pillaged crops, healthcare centres, schools, and other civilian infrastructure. Real-time reporting has been challenging throughout this conflict, given the government's shutdown of communications and access restrictions. But we have continued to report on events, speaking to displaced communities, seizing moments when communications are restored to gather information, and using satellite imagery to corroborate witness accounts. Actions by warring parties to cut off civilians in Tigray from the world have left communities reeling, not only from the atrocities they face, but by a sense of being forgotten. Victims deserve to know that Australia will take concerted and concrete measures to end their suffering and to hold perpetrators to account. After Ethiopian federal forces pulled out of most of Tigray and declared a unilateral ceasefire at the end of June, the government imposed an effective siege on the Tigray region, blocking food, medicine, cash, and fuel in violation of international humanitarian law. Now, this has stymied the recovery of health services and directly contributed to a major humanitarian disaster. 5.2 million people are currently in need in Tigray. 350,000 were already starving in June. Today, Human Rights Watch releases a new report which highlights the devastating impact of aid restrictions on aid agencies to respond to the many needs of victims of sexual violence. These women and children already suffered gang rape and sexual slavery. Now the government's policies are victimizing them again. Attacks, including airstrikes, extrajudicial killings, and arrests have continued, notably in Western Tigray, where thousands of Tigrayans were forcibly displaced in early 2021 by Amhara forces and militia. Human Rights Watch has also documented serious abuses by Tigrayan militias against Eritrean refugees in Tigray and received reports of summary executions and sexual violence by Tigrayan forces against Amhara civilians as the fighting has expanded to that region in July. As we speak, as Amnesty mentioned, a sweeping state of emergency declared by the Ethiopian government last week is legitimizing and legalizing acts of unlawful detentions, ethnic profiling, and enforced disappearances of ethnic Tigrayans that have occurred in waves since the beginning of the conflict. In the last days alone, we have spoken to relatives whose loved ones have been detained. They've been denied access to them, or they're too scared to try and locate their relatives out of fear they may be detained themselves. We have also received reports of an increase in arrests of Oromos, again at risk of being branded as supporters of the opposition. Ethiopian staff members working at UN agencies have been swept up in the recent detentions. Journalists and humanitarian workers are also at risk. There has been an increase in inflammatory rhetoric by government and public officials over the last 10 days, and that increases the likelihood of violence against specific ethnic groups. Facebook, of course, removed an October 31 statement by the Prime Minister, which called on Ethiopians to take up arms and bury the TPLF. Last week, the UN Human Rights Office and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission released a much anticipated joint report into abuses committed in the first 9 months of the conflict. That report does find evidence of serious abuses, some of which may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, given this crisis, a stronger, more effective response from the Australian government, coordinated with international partners, is urgently needed. Warring parties need to recognise that there are immediate and long-term consequences for their heinous crimes. In particular, the Australian government should press all parties to the conflict to halt abuses and allow rapid, unimpeded aid access into areas under their effective control. Australia should call on the Ethiopian authorities to end restrictions on basic services in Tigray, including communications and banking. Amid these rising tensions, secondly, Australia should also call on the warring parties and public officials to denounce hate speech, incitement to violence, and statements that invite hostility or discrimination. The Ethiopian government needs to end its very public attacks on humanitarian actors. Thirdly, given the widespread and systematic violations of the law of war, the government should immediately suspend the transfer and sale of arms and equipment to Ethiopia and Eritrea and encourage other governments to follow suit. In that vein, the government should also publicly express support for a global arms embargo through the UN Security Council, and Australia should urge the Security Council to hold regular public meetings on Tigray. Fifthly, the government should publicly support efforts at the UN Human Rights Council to urgently establish an independent international investigative mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of atrocities as a follow-up to the recent UN report. And finally, to put warring parties on notice that Australia should make it clear that they stand ready to adopt targeted sanctions against Ethiopian and Eritrean individuals and entities that are responsible for serious human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mayerson, or a representative of the Australia-Tigray Alliance?
Yes, thank you, Kevin Andrews, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Saron. I'm here today as a proud Australian Tigrayan woman and as a representative of the Australia-Tigray Alliance. I'm joined by fellow members Mahatot Yainu, Dr. Deborah Mason, a genocide scholar, Dr. Tagay Arsa, a legal scholar, and Onoromo, along with our colleagues from ATCAN. The Tigray War began on the 4th of November 2020. This war was started by the Ethiopian government, disguised as law enforcement, and supported by the Eritrean government and regional militia. Crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide feature heavily in this war. Over the past year, Tigrayans have been collectively punished, with 1 million people living in a man-made famine, one of the worst and biggest that the world has seen in recent decades, with 5.7 million people living on the brink and many who are dying daily. Agricultural activity has been disrupted by the Ethiopian government, prevents journalists and aid agencies from working in the region. My own family in central Tigray have had their cattle and farmland taken away from them, and they've been threatened with execution if they try to do anything about it. Since November 2020, over 60,000 refugees have fled the region into neighbouring Sudan. Only 10% of the region's humanitarian aid is getting into Tigray. An estimated 50,000 civilians have been killed. Every Australian Tigrayan person has had at least one family member killed as a result of this genocide. One of the witnesses here today has lost 24 family members. 70% of healthcare facilities have been looted or vandalised by invading forces, including the only specialist clinic providing care to rape victims. The UNFPA estimates that 22,500 women have been raped and need sexual violence support. This number is purported to be much higher. Weaponized rape is being deliberately used to harm Tigrayan women, with Ethiopian and Eritrean troops telling their victims that they want to ensure that no Tigrayan woman bears another child ever again, and they want to cleanse their identity. Victims have reported that nails have been inserted into their wombs in an attempt to render them infertile. As a global community, we've only been able to piece together these devastating facts based on accessing 20% of Tigray. I can't imagine what we'll find out when the other 80% is accessible. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Maru, or a representative of the Alliance of Tigrayan Community Associations.
Thank you very much. My name is Yehayis Maru. Thank you for the opportunity to make a statement on behalf of the Alliance of Tigrayan communities in Australia and New Zealand. I'll focus on two of the many aspects of the genocidal war on Tigrayans that have been having significant negative impact on Tigrayan diaspora here in Australia. The first is on the gross injustice, anger, and dejection we are feeling because of the joint investigation of the human rights violations in Tigray by the United Nations Human Rights Office with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, an arm of the Ethiopian government, the chief architect of this genocide. This joint investigation was against the will of the victims of the genocidal war and Tigrayans across the world, including here in Australia, who rejected it right from its inception and repeatedly called for UN-only independent investigation. This severely compromised joint investigation has reported a biased, deliberately watered down, and incomplete findings that sidelined and denied the victims justice, but provided a veil of protection to the perpetrators to continue to commit war crimes, making it harder for Tigrayans and Ethiopians to find a just foundation for lasting peace and reconciliation. We appeal to the Australian government to reconsider its position on the joint investigation and call for a new and independent victim-centered investigation. The second is on weaponized starvation and man-made famine. In Tigray, subsistence farming is a mainstay of 84% of the estimated 6.8 million people. Deaths from starvation started last February after farmers lost their entire crop on the war and have been deliberately subjected to pillaging, looting, and destruction of their crops, livestock, and farm assets. In last May, June, they were prevented from cultivating and now only expect 20% of the crop yield, even that is, if not, lost to impending desert locusts. Since June, there has been a complete siege, blockage of humanitarian aid and basic services, communication, electricity, and banking, which led to more than 5.2 million in dire need of life-saving aid, with 900,000 in famine, and hundreds being starved to death every day. We do not know what is happening to our extended families and cannot help because the Ethiopian government has cut off communication and banking. Year-long, it is distressing to see a UN and the international community unable to halt even this evil and open act of extermination. There must be immediate solution as death numbers from famine grow exponentially, and even ceasefire should not be a precondition. The international community needs to intervene urgently via air delivery of humanitarian aid to save millions of lives from death and a lifelong condemnation to misery from malnutrition. Details on those two aspects and other strategies of the genocidal war on Tigray and our recommendations are given in a statement that we submitted to the committee. Thank you very much, and I will pass it to Professor Atahualti Hailu to make a statement.
Is someone else going to add to those comments? Otherwise, we will go to questions.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you. My name is Atahualti Hailu, representing ATCAN and also myself, and I would like to thank you for the chance to make this statement.
Could you
My daughter
keep it, Mr.
recently...
Hailu, I'm just aware of the time, so if you can keep it to a couple of minutes, that would be helpful. Not that I want to cut you off, but I want to have adequate time for committee members to ask questions.
Okay. My daughter recently asked me a question I did not expect, but that's a question that could summarize what the war has done to many of us. When the war in Tigray ends, she said, will we go back to being Ethiopians again? Everything has changed since November 4, 2020, and my daughter is struggling to understand why. We are all struggling to understand how innocent Tigrayans, young and old, everywhere, anywhere and everywhere, became the primary target of the war. When the war began, the Ethiopian leader had declared that it would take only 3 weeks at most, and that it was just a law and order operation meant to arrest a dozen TPLF leaders. That was false, as most things that Abiy Ahmed says are. Most major towns in Tigray had been shelled, people had been slaughtered in many towns, ethnic cleansing was underway in western Tigray, and over 1 million people were and are still displaced. Tens of thousands had fled to the Sudan for safety before the border was sealed. The war was a genocide from day one and continues to be today. Between November and June, the entire Tigrayan population was at the mercy of a brutal occupation where soldiers, domestic and foreign, committed countless atrocities, over 260 massacres under a complete communications and media blackout. Horrendous crimes continue to be inflicted on civilians in western Tigray by Amhara, Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. The Europe, Kunama and others living along the northern border continue to suffer under Eritrean occupation. Tigrayans living throughout Ethiopia have suffered for the entire year. When the war started, Tigrayan members of the army and security services were purged, placed in concentration camps. Former members of the government, including MPs, were put into prison, including the former ambassador to Ethiopian ambassador to Australia and China. Now, under Ethiopia's new state of emergency laws, any Tigrayan in Ethiopia can be arrested or is under the threat of being arrested, including those who have lived in Addis Ababa for their entire lives. In the last few weeks alone, we have learned about the murder of several innocent people, including university professors, by vigilante groups. This should be openly and publicly condemned by the Australian government. The PM and other Ethiopian leaders are not calling for a peaceful resolution, but are making hate speech and calls for serious crimes against civilians, especially Tigrayans. This has also affected tens of thousands of Tigrayan businesses, small and large. Once Tigrayans were seen as an essential part of Ethiopia and played a key role in the fabric of Ethiopian society and government. Since last November, the Ethiopian government has moved to ostracize them, and consequently, they need your voice and your actions. Abiy's 3-year tenure is characterized not by peace or prosperity, by hope or harmony, but by ethnic strife, internal displacement, economic decline and inflation, a disastrous conflict, and the shattering of Ethiopia's social fabric. This has affected not only Tigrayans, but Oromos, Somalis, Kmants, Amharas, and many others. Abiy Ahmed and his Prosperity Party cannot heal Ethiopia. The Australian government should look ahead and work with those who will. If one looks across the Red Sea to Yemen, it's not difficult to imagine that Ethiopia could degenerate into a similar situation unless resolution is found quickly. That requires strong voices from around the world, including Australia's. And if I add one last sentence, the TPLF, the government of Tigray, is the most legitimate government in Ethiopia now. It's not a rebel, it's not a terrorist. It was elected in September 2020 by 2.7 million Tigrayans, and that's a fact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can lead off with questions then. In terms of the United Nations and global response, I'm interested in which countries are likely to have the most influence in terms of bringing about some sort of cessation of hostilities within the country. I'm not asking anybody in particular, but if anybody would like to make a comment, I think that would be useful for the committee to know where we can best direct our efforts as a nation.
The United States government is working most strongly upon this and is taking the most robust policy responses. And I'd strongly encourage the Australian government to work closely with the United States because their efforts are proving most influential and effective at this time. There's also a good opportunity to work with the government of Kenya in this space.
And Dr. Mason, I thank you for that comment. If I can just follow up before going to the Deputy Chair, I note that the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, made a statement on the 15th of May of this year condemning the violence and calling it unequivocally upon governments of Eritrea and Ethiopia to take all necessary steps. In terms of practical action, can you fill that out any further as to what has happened and given the concern about this, where are the roadblocks to something further concrete occurring?
Certainly. The United States government has so far donated about $500 million this year, I understand. We also have the United Nations involved and the African Union involved. However, the United States is perhaps in the most uncompromised and impartial position to take a strong stance. And note that not only has Antony Blinken called this situation ethnic cleansing, there's deep concern as to whether this could be genocide. So, for example, both the current and former head of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in the United Nations are calling this out as a human-induced famine that has been caused by the Ethiopian government blockading humanitarian access and food access to Tigray. And everyone from Antonio Guterres to Antony Blinken to all the senior officials involved are recognizing the need for pressure to be put on the Ethiopian government to stop that blockade and allow humanitarian access to Tigray. And Australia would be very well placed to join that call and work with the United States government to increase pressure on the Ethiopian government to allow that access and prevent the continuation of the famine.
And just one final thing, you mentioned Kenya. Given that Kenya is a neighbouring country, what influence does Kenya have?
I think Kenya has influenced precisely that as a neighbour, as a member of the African Union, and as a country that has in recent months recognised that the Ethiopian government has gone too far. So we need to be working with those allies that have influence on the Ethiopian government to get it to change its course from facilitating, from causing this humanitarian crisis to a more moderate and reasonable course, allowing humanitarian access, participating in mediation, and moving Ethiopia back from the brink of catastrophe.
Mr Hayes?
Thank you, Chair. Well, can I just follow on from that and talking about the US approach? I'm not aware that they've actually implemented any targeted sanctions at this stage, but is that something that's been contemplated in respect to Ethiopia?
I understand that all options are on the table, but they're under consideration at the moment. Certainly, the Foreign Affairs Committee is watching the crisis very closely, and we should consider targeted sanctions from Australia, but also consider, banning the sales of weapons to Ethiopia and Eritrea under our commitments under the Arms Trade Treaty, which Australia ratified in 2014, that really prohibits us from selling arms to countries committing mass atrocities. And we have clear case here of crimes against humanity and war crimes, and quite possibly even we should be considering this as a potential case of genocide.
But as you say, that
Sorry. I was just going to add on to what Deborah was saying and say that in September, the US did actually establish a sanctions regime for northern Ethiopia, which allows, so it was an executive order signed by the President, Joe Biden, and it allows the US government to deny visas to and freeze the assets of individuals and entities responsible for serious human rights abuses, including obstruction of humanitarian aid.
Have they identified individuals to be subject to those sanctions?
Someone else may know this better than me. I had understood, I think, that some Eritrean officials may have been identified, but I'm not sure whether any Ethiopian officials have.
I can interject there. Yes, the US government has made some restrictions, visa restrictions for some authorities.
So I think some of them are, so they're like the visa bans, but they might not necessarily be yet on the targeted sanctions list. So they're sort of different levels.
Yes. Can I then go to the issues about the roadblocks that appear to be evident in respect to the provision of humanitarian aid? What governments are working to, other than making a call for allowing aid workers to be able to exercise their responsibilities? But what effectively is being done on the ground, because I understand aid is still being restricted to much of the areas involved?
Can I interject here? Hayes Maru here. I will closely follow this because we have families there. Effectively, there's no aid coming in. A lot of the agencies in Tigray have stopped. There's no fuel. There's no money. So I think the calls have been happening for almost a year. We don't think, since we have waited for quite long, there's no avenue to force the Ethiopian government to release aid. Instead, we have been demanding what was happening in other places, aerial delivery, direct aerial delivery. We know that it's expensive, but saving lives is an important mission that needs to happen because 5.2 million people are going to perish, and they are perishing now. And if there was a mechanism that Australian government could coordinate with other nations to try to deliver aid aerially, directly, that would have been a better solution rather than waiting for Ethiopian government to open up.
And as I
Also
understand,
like to add in there. Sorry.
To add to that, the US government has precedent doing this to prevent genocide on Mount Sinjar in the case when ISIS was targeting the Yazidis in 2014 and did so successfully. And so Australian government working with the US government to do this for Tigray is something that would have precedent and would be very effective.
thank you. I've got no further questions, Chair.
Senator Rice.
Thank you. Look, thank you all for your for appearing before us this afternoon and for your presenting of the information about what's going on in Ethiopia and Tigray in particular. And I know how distressing it is, particularly for those of you that have got family and friends who are being affected by the conflict. I want to ask you how Australia should respond, particularly given the differing versions of events which are about the conflict that are being presented. That there has been versions of what's going on that have been presented to our committee, which talk about the military aggression of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and that was how the war was started, and that essentially that we need to be stopping all violence, essentially. So I'm just interested in your response to the fact that there are these differing versions on the ground different versions of what is actually happening on the ground.
Thank you. I can speak to this one. So as we've provided more detail in the written submission around this as well, but we're urging, I guess, Australia to consider a few steps with regards to this conflict. So the first one we're asking for is a motion to be passed in the House or Senate to publicly condemn the Ethiopian and Eritrean government of the acts of genocide being committed in Tigray. We're asking for call for immediate and complete and verified withdrawal of the Ethiopian, Eritrean and Amhara militia from Tigray. We're asking for demand that the Ethiopian government immediately releases the tens of thousands of Tigrayan and other ethnicities that have been identified as political prisoners. We ask for Australia to increase the aid commitment to Tigray. We appreciate the $6 million that has been provided so far. We're also asking for an increase in Australia's commitment to the Tigrayan children across various organizations such as UNICEF. And as a founding member of the call to action, we're also asking Australia to fund the treatment of mental and physical health of those affected by the gender-based sexual violence. We're also asking for the withdrawal of non-emergency assistance to Ethiopian and Eritrean governments and imposing the Autonomous Sanctions Act 2011 on those who have committed the serious human rights abuses, as Australia has done for Myanmar. We request an independent, internationally led investigation. We're also asking for the Australian government to provide funding to support Australian Tigrayans who have been traumatized by war crimes and genocide in Tigray through culturally competent mental health and counseling services. The final ask that we have is Australia signed the Arms Trade Treaty in 2013 and ratified it in 2014. And thus we're asking for the withdrawal of Category 1 and Category 2 permits for the sale of military equipment to Ethiopia and Eritrea, respectively. That is the asks that have been detailed also in the written submission. Thank you.
Can I just add as well, just to what you were talking about, Janet, that I think unless there's a fully independent investigation and one that doesn't involve the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, a lot of the claims that are made on the ground will be really hard and difficult to verify. I think both sides are, I guess, have their own facts and figures and recounts of what is happening. But as Yaheyas and Professor Atakhalti mentioned earlier, unless we have an investigation without the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, it will be really difficult to verify a lot of these things. So I think that that's perhaps a place that Australia can come in and play and actually support the UN and other agencies and bodies in essentially carrying out those reports. Amnesty has done a great job of, I guess, getting a lot of the on-the-ground facts and figures independently of the Ethiopian government as well as the Human Rights Watch. So that's perhaps a way that Australia can do that.
If I could also speak to that from a mass atrocities perspective. In the case of mass atrocities, there's very often a complex narrative and complex events underway. And what we need to recognise is that perpetrators also try and create those complex narratives to promote inaction, because when there is a complex narrative, no one knows quite what to do. What we do have absolute clarity around here is that we have a human-induced famine, and we have everyone from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to the Chief of the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs at the UN, all recognising that the Ethiopian government is responsible for the creation and perpetuation of the blockade to Tigray that's preventing food, medicines, and essential items getting to Tigray and causing famine-like conditions. We have absolute clarity around that. So I suggest that we can readily identify what's happening in that situation, and we focus on remediating that situation initially, because that offers the greatest opportunity to save lives.
Just add some of the questions that Senator Rice raised. The first one is about who instigated this war. The Prime Minister in May declared, saying that if the Tigrayan government go ahead with the election of its regional election, that women will cry, young men will die, and houses and infrastructure will be destroyed. That's what he said. And they were ready to strike if the Tigray government went its own election, a regional election, which is constitutionally allowed. So they were ready, and the fight, the war started, and the intention was to exterminate Tigrayans. The second one is that the Tigray Defense Forces waited for almost a year until this the humanitarian blockade could be lifted, and there was lots of waiting. And now they are moving to unblock the blockade, because the international community has been woefully slow and hasn't, beyond expressing concerns, nothing has been done to unblock the situation. And this war is continuing because the fact that that this blockage has to be lifted. The third one is that the Tigrayan Defense Forces have been asking for independent investigation, even the crimes that I have been alleged to have done. And there's only one way to find out whether the alleged crimes have been also committed by the Tigrayan defenses could be found out by having an independent investigation. That's what we are calling. Everyone has to be accountable, whether it's Tigrayan or Amhara or somebody else, if they committed the crime. There's no ethnicity that we favor. If there are committed crimes, that has to be investigated. But those are the facts that the committee has to know about who initiated it, why this conflict is expanding, and the call for independent investigation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Hill, and then Ms. Van Backenau.
Thank you all for your presentation. I won't go into the impact on the diaspora communities, but I just want to note that they're well covered and articulated in the submission. Certainly myself, I've spoken to a number of people locally, given there is a presence in my electorate, and the display some weeks ago at Parliament was incredibly moving, harrowing, I must say. So thank you for your work in putting forward this view. Can I just pick up, firstly, I don't have many questions because I think we've covered a fair bit, but there was a reference made earlier in the discussion. I think even countries such as Kenya recognise that the government's gone too far, if you like, in the human blockade and creating a humanitarian crisis. Can I ask Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, I understand the view that's being put forward by the Tigrayan advocates and groups that no reliance can be placed on the work of the Human Rights Commission, given the nature of the composition of that. The report which we've received and seen was a joint report by the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, and even in accounting for complex narratives, it does outline that there was a methodology of a joint investigation team that was agreed that seems to be a standard methodology. I'd be interested in your comment and view as to whether any reliance can be placed on that work, given it does involve the UNHCR, who are not in the habit of putting their names to completely dodgy methodologies.
So just to speak to that from Amnesty's point of view, I have spoken to our researchers who are in the process right now of doing a really detailed analysis of that report, so that they can respond to it. So we don't currently have a response to the report, but we will very shortly. And because of the concerns that have been raised here around the report, we haven't responded to it yet, and instead are doing that analysis. And so I will hopefully be able to pass that on to you within a few days, and to other members of the committee as well.
Thanks.
I don't want to speak to it before we have that analysis.
That'd be really helpful and entirely appropriate that you provide us with a considered view. If you could perhaps take that on notice as a question on notice to follow up, I'm sure we'd all be interested. Elaine, did you have any comment on that, Ms. Pearson?
Yeah, I'd just like to sort of add on that. I mean, the report does find, evidence of extrajudicial killings and sexual violence, arbitrary detention, torture. These are very serious abuses. And actually, I mean, that report itself by the Human Rights Office and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, says it is far from a full rendering of the devastation that has been experienced by civilians. And the report doesn't really give well-documented trends the attention that they deserve. For instance, it doesn't really mention very well the abuses that are committed by Amhara regional forces and militia against Tigrayans in Western Tigray. I mean, it does document sexual violence by all warring parties, but it doesn't really acknowledge the scale of the abuses, including sexual slavery by Ethiopian, Eritrean and Amhara forces. And I think it does kind of gloss over a bit the deliberate destruction and pillaging of health infrastructure and the intimidation of humanitarian workers. So I think it's a bit mixed, and I guess that's why this report for us, it's really like the first step. What we really want to see is some kind of mechanism that is international, independent, that can collect and preserve evidence with a view towards accountability. And we know the UN has set these up in the past. They've done so with Syria, they've done so with Myanmar, with North Korea. So absolutely, this needs to be a priority for the UN Human Rights Council. And I would hope that the Australian government, really puts its support behind such a mechanism.
Okay, so it's a reasonable conclusion on the face of it. And I appreciate we'll get some more considered advice that there may well have been violations by all parties, but the report perhaps doesn't provide a sense of balance as to the extent of violations by the government in this regard. Is that a reasonable kind of takeout from what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they also admitted, right, that they had access, they had access issues in terms of getting to the conflict zone. And so there were methodological constraints there as well. So yes, I think that's correct.
I suppose I'd just note and invite any other comment on the reality is Australia's national interests here are limited beyond a general interest in protecting and advocating for human rights and regional stability in Africa, and our national power is 2/5 of very little. Our ability to influence this is exceptionally limited, if we're honest. Sure, we can do aid, sure, we can pass motions, but none of that's really going to influence or be of any interest to the Ethiopian government. And unless someone wants to correct me, I'm not aware that targeted sanctions would have any impact whatsoever on the decision-making of the Ethiopian government. I'm not aware of large commercial interests that they have here, as in the case of Cambodia, say, or significant movement and family members and so on. Happy to be corrected on that. Is a political solution to this, if the blockade and the humanitarian issue is resolved, is there anything Australia can realistically do regarding a political solution, or is it other actors like the African Union, the United States and so on?
The United States government has been looking to build a coalition on this. I know that Antony Blinken raised that at the G20 meeting recently. And so the Australian government would do very well to embellish its power by coordinating with the US government on this issue to have as much impact as it could.
Could I make a comment on this?
Sure. Yes, please.
Yeah, just first on your point that Australia might not have much influence. I think that's something you shouldn't underestimate. It doesn't matter whether we are giving aid or anything. The voice of any country, especially countries like Australia, doesn't matter. This is a war that's also being fought on social media. It's a propaganda war, is a major component of it. So governments denouncing things or giving ideas is important. The other thing is, okay, in terms of political solutions, I lived in Ethiopia throughout the civil war between 74 and 91. I left Ethiopia just at the end of the war. I have lived through the Eritrean-Ethiopian war and now this. I am not an expert on political economy and things like that, but as a person who has been around, if I have to make any observations, I think right now things are very difficult because the groups that are active in Ethiopia have interests that are diametrically opposed. Okay? We know what Eritrea is doing. This is not just Ethiopia's war, it's Eritrea's war. Abiy Ahmed came into power 3 years ago as a reformist. He is not a reformist. He said the good 27 years between 91 and 2018 were the dark ages, but now many people would agree that the dark ages are his actually years, 3 years. What I see as a big vacuum in Ethiopia is a new leadership among the Amhara is the missing link. That's what I see. Because now Tigrayans are working with Oromos. Oromos have their true leaders in prison or outside the country. Tigrayans, we were never members of a political party. I have never been a member of a political party. Okay, but Tigrayans are united because of what happened in Tigray. They support the TPLF right now, even those who were not supporting it before the war support it. So Ethiopians are united, Tigrayans are united. People should not underestimate. There is no TPLF and there is no Tigrayans. There is only Tigrayans now. But the Amharas need a new leadership because most of their leaders, even those who were part of the old regime that was kicked out in 91, they are back. And all they want to do is to reverse things back to where they were pre-1991, and that's not going to work. Oromos are not going to sit around and just let Amharas roll back everything that was achieved since 91. Tigrayans are not going to do that. The missing link in Ethiopia's politics is a new Amhara leadership. Unfortunately, the moderate voices like Ludetu Ayale were thrown into prison, and after much hassle, he is now out in the US. And I cannot see who the next Amhara leader will be. But that's the missing link. Thank you.
Can I just also add there as well, just based on what you just asked, I think as well Australia has a responsibility to protect. We're one of the founders of the R2P principle, and there have been several instances over the course of the history of our nation where we have led and been a leading advocate for international implementation of R2P. The Yazidi genocide, East Timor, and the apartheid in South Africa. Australia led the boycott of foreign investment to South Africa, which helped end that apartheid. Similarly, with the Yazidi genocide, the House of Representatives did agree to a motion recognizing the ISIS perpetrated genocide of the Yazidi community in northern Iraq. And to the same effect of what Professor Takhliti said, I think these things have impact and weight, not just in our local community and in making us feel like our government recognises what is happening over there, but also internationally. And we would love to see the Australian government be more actively engaged in this diplomacy and not just sit back and follow through with what other people are doing, just as we've done in the past with the genocides that I just mentioned.
I strongly second.
If I may, I also wanted to add one point about the passing the resolution against the Ethiopian government. I think Australia should not underestimate the moral impact, the moral gesture that it makes if you take it to the floor and pass a resolution. And secondly, because this is a government that is lacking in support in the old allies, such as America, it might turn to other countries that did not yet stand with America. So it might turn to you, as it did, for example, turn it to Turkey, turn it to China, to Russia, and to other countries, and it might turn to Australia and some other countries such as this. So I think it is important that we make that statement, public condemnation of what is going on, to put pressure on the Ethiopian government. The second thing is the solution. Of course, there is only a political solution because this is created by a political problem fundamentally. Because of the clashing visions about state building, nation building, management of diversity in Ethiopia. And that political solution obviously is not going to come from outside. Pressures will help, sanctions will help, and yes, America has, the United States has issued a visa limitation. It has also removed Ethiopia from the Free Trade Agreement on Agriculture, AGOA, which is quite helpful, at least for the moment. But of course, it might also as well be bad for the workers and the farmers. Yet that sanction is good. However, the solution comes from home, and I would like to make the point that recently there is a united front against Abiy Ahmed's regime from various political parties, about 9 political parties representing various ethnic groups, including the Oromo Liberation Army, the Oromo Liberation Front. So these are the solutions that have to be supported and that have to be somehow forced to negotiate a peaceful settlement that will also make sure that the violations of human rights and the humanitarian crisis are addressed properly. And probably Australia will join the Chorus of Nations and different other initiatives to support some sort of transitional arrangement and transitional justice, especially as we look forward to an independent international inquiry into all the atrocities that have happened across the country, in not just in Tigray, but also in Oromia, as we shall see later in the next hearing, and trying to help an independent investigation and trying to help Ethiopia make sure that the perpetrators are accountable, make sure that the relationship between perpetrators and victims and bystanders and beneficiaries are transformed for good. Okay. So I don't think Australia should underestimate its
Can I just thank you for those answers collectively, because they are questions people come to us all the time and say Australia should fix the problem. Of course, our national power is limited, and I know you're not silly people, but I think it's important to actually push back on that so that we can go a little deeper and understand your thinking and motivations, and they're very coherent and sensible answers. So thank you. The final question I've got, Chair, just briefly, how often do you engage with DFAT regarding these issues, and when did you last meet with the Foreign Minister?
Hayes might be able to answer.
That's for everyone.
I think.
Yeah.
So,
we had a conversation with the DFAT, particularly the African desk and African Middle East secretary, but we haven't had any chance to meet with our foreign minister. We've attempted to do that. We have never had any chance doing that. But we have been expressing our concerns, including the concern that we expressed about the joint investigation, and are also just emphasizing that, Australia might not feel that it has any reach to Tigray, but we are Tigrayans here. We are Australians, and it's affecting us. When it affects us, it affects Australia. And Australia should not consider, because it's far, if we don't work well, if we don't sleep well, if we are traumatized, Australia's economy, Australia's fabric is also affected. So we should not underestimate. And the fact that also the dictatorship that is forming in East Africa has been forming is a significant danger for democracy. We have to understand, we shouldn't have to underestimate the impact it has when you allow people like Abiy Ahmed trying to kill Oromos, Tigrayans and what have you, and allow those dictatorships to form in East Africa, which has also aligning with other dictators across the world.
Thank you. I think the two questions I asked there were narrow because I know the chair needs to move on. So there's no one that's actually had a meeting with the foreign minister.
We, Amnesty and a few other members of the diaspora met with her staff in June, and then with DFAT, with the Africa desk in July, but we have not met before or after. We haven't met with the foreign minister.
I'll just add from the Alliance's perspective, we've requested meetings with the minister, but we've only met with the advisor to Africa Affairs, but we hope to meet with her soon.
Thank you.
Ms. Van Bakenau.
Thank you. I think a number of the issues I was interested in were covered with Mr. Hill's questions, but at the end of the day, this is a very distressing situation. What capacity, if anything, do you realistically believe we have to broker some sort of dialogue process? And how does that get initiated? Can you see a situation where the United Nations may be pressured or asked to provide an envoy that would be able to bring together all those varying threads that we've discussed to come to some sort of dialogue process? Because in the absence of that, it seems very difficult to bring the Ethiopian government to yield, because as I think it was noted earlier, it's already been suggested that they can't present government can't heal Ethiopia. So who best can and how best do it?
So the African Union is currently involved in the dialogue process with the Ethiopian government. And if the Australian government wanted to have a role in that, it would be very helpful for the Australian government to put pressure on the African Union to make sure that that process is as uncompromised as possible and as powerful as possible, and for the African Union to understand that Australia cares about this, that Australia feels a great deal of urgency about the need for that blockade to be ended, that we're an interested party within this.
Just to add on to that, I mean, the special envoy for the AU is the former Nigerian President, Obasanjo, and I think the AU's, record of speaking out on this conflict has been largely inadequate despite those diplomatic efforts. So I think, the focus of the international community, concerned countries like Australia, really should be on pressuring the AU and African leaders to be pushing privately and publicly.
Did you say the EU?
AU, African Union.
AU.
African Union, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
If I may make just a short point.
Sure.
I think the issue around humanitarian aid is very much linked to the resolution of the war, because part of the strategy is to destroy Tigray, to dehumanize it, to make people forget who they are by so all those sexual violences, and finally to starve it. And this is not the first time this has happened. In 1976, I was giving out macaroni that had been maybe spoiled with some beetles out of my shop to Eritrean neighbors who had been displaced because the Eritrean forces had surrounded Asmara and they were starving. And it's the same leaders that are now blockading Tigray. So allowing aid to flow into Tigray would lessen the control that the federal government has on what happened. And that's the key thing. If there is food going into Tigray, the government would negotiate. And that's what I believe.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to add one thing in response to what Maria you just asked. I think just acknowledging that, yes, Australia is not a big trading partner in the Horn of Africa, and particularly to Ethiopia. But our understanding is that the Australian government has been a good friend to the Ethiopian government. In the past, the Ethiopian government has used, I guess, essentially the Australian government's ability to get into the UN Human Rights Council. So our feeling is that this relationship between the Australian government and the Ethiopian government potentially gives our government the opportunity to speak honestly and truthfully with the Ethiopian government and to basically bring a lot of these issues to the forefront and have that conversation with them to, I guess, achieve the outcomes that are outlined in the recommendations that we've made. So I guess I think just, having that sort of honest and truthful dialogue with them about this and using those levers within both the UN and the African Union to put that pressure on them. I just wanted to reiterate that.
So Ron, you believe that we, the Australian government, actually on the basis of that can be a lot more forceful in its interventions to bring about certain outcomes?
Yes,
right?
I do. Yes.
Just if I may add, I think Australia, like it's been said, has limited, resources, limited sort of reach, which is, putting voice is an important part, condemning, putting voice, strong sort of condemnation is an important part of the strategy, so that the government does know that it's not just about expressing concerns and but condemnation would be very important as just public condemnation of some of the atrocities. But I think also we need to differentiate between having a settlement, a long-lasting settlement, which would take time. In the meantime, a lot of people die. Famine has a dynamic that starts slow and then exponentially wipes out a lot of people. So Australia could make significant input into aerial delivery of food that also puts pressure, political pressure on the government. So if we could focus on making sure that the women that have been raped, now starving to die, receive food, that would be a very important piece that Australia could contribute. Thank you.
I think a final comment I had was in regards to the military weapons and the sale of military equipment to Ethiopia and Eritrea. So bringing it back, I guess, to our final asks within the recommendations, that the written submission is the withdrawal of the Category 1, Category 2 permits of sales to both Eritrea and Ethiopia, who are major human rights violators in this war. So I think that's an important point as well.
Can I ask whether Senator Fawcett or Mr Khalil have any questions?
Yes, Chair, I do. Thank you. Unless Senator Fawcett wants to go first.
I think.
No, that's fine. Peter, feel free.
Go ahead, Mr Khalil.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of the participants. And I've been on the call. I was a bit late, but I've been on the call for the last 20 minutes. So if I've missed sort of the first part of your testimony, please forgive me. And I really wanted to just go to that key question that I think you've all sort of been discussing in the last 10 minutes or so, and that is what more Australia can do. And obviously noting that there's, as I think one of the witnesses said, it really is about a limited amount of resources that we have and ability. But clearly it seems to me it's coming from you that we can do a lot more than just some statements. So I want to kind of zoom in on that and what you think that might be. Working with the US, working with other partners, putting a bit more of the Minister for Foreign Affairs' efforts into something like this to try and push towards some of the objectives that have been highlighted. So that's one part. If you think that's something that you would want Australia to pursue, and in which way, but also the media side of things. Have you had any traction as far as highlighting the human rights issues and the atrocities and the other things that are occurring there with any of the mainstream media? Because again, when that advocacy starts to cut through and the mainstream population sees what's going on, then that can also add the pressure onto our governments to actually take more substantive action.
Can I ask if anybody wants to answer just to address the second question, because I think the first one's been well canvassed and we're over time already. So
yeah, sorry.
That's right. You'll be able to look at the transcript, Mr Khalil, but any comments on Mr Khalil's question about the role of the media?
Inexplicably, this crisis is getting much more attention in overseas media, for example, PBS NewsHour, that kind of thing, than it's getting in Australia. But that's certainly something that I know the Australian Tigrayan Alliance is working on to get additional media coverage. One of the things that's hampering that is the media blockade. So no media, no images, no videos are coming out of Tigray at the moment because the Ethiopian government has got that blockade so tight. And of course, media want images and videos to work with. So that's been a difficult issue, but certainly that's something that the Australian Tigrayan Alliance is working on, getting increased media coverage as it is attracting overseas.
So I'll speak a bit more to that as well. So we've been able to get very limited, but little coverage with SBS, ABC, Dateline covering a few of those stories within our community and also the crisis that is unfolding still to this day in Tigray. Gaining access or ability to broadcast on mainstream media such as Channel 9 has shown a little bit of difficulty, and that is something that we've continued to work around. Having various hearings across universities is also another avenue that we've approached. But I guess going back to the first question, everything is in the written submission as well, so we do really encourage for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Fawcett.
Time, I'll leave it, given most of the issues have been covered well.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett. Can I therefore thank everybody who's participated in this session today. You'll each be sent a copy of the transcript, and if there are any corrections you wish to make, you'll be able to make them and forward them back to the Secretariat. If you have agreed to provide some additional information, Mr Hill in particular was asking about some further information, it'd be appreciative if you'd have it back to us by the 18th of November. But once again, thank you very much for your participation, and we will move. We might just suspend for a minute whilst those who want to drop out do, and I think everybody is online for the next session. We'll start in about 1 minute's time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
We'll continue with the second session of today's hearings, and I'd like to welcome various diaspora groups. I might just run through the groups and ask you to name yourself and the position in which you occupy. So can I start with Diaspora Action Australia? Ms. Lazzati.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Lorenza Lazzati, Program Coordinator at Diaspora Action Australia.
The Permanent Humanitarian Fund for Oromos, Mr. Arasa. You're on mute, I think, Mr. Arasa.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Agai Arasa. I'm from JIRA, Permanent Humanitarian Fund for Oromos.
The Oromia Support Group Australia, Dr. Truman and Mr. Kufi.
Good afternoon. My name is Trevor Truman. I'm from the Oromia Support Group in the UK.
Mr. Kufi.
My name is Maram Kofi, Oromia Support Group, Australian branch.
And the Oromian Women Association of Australia, Mrs. Dinka.
Hi, my name is Lenza. I'm representing the Oromian Women Australia. Thank you.
And is Ms. Barayu with us?
Hello, yes, my name is Mira Barayu and I'm supporting the Oromo Women's Association of Australia.
Good. Can I thank you all for your participation today? Can I invite each of the groups to make some opening comments? Again, if you can keep them to 5 minutes, that will help us enable members of the committee to be able to ask questions. So, Ms. Lazati, would you like to begin? We don't seem to have Ms. Lazati.
Apology, I turned off my video because my connection is not particularly good.
We can hear you, so if you wish to go ahead, we can hear you.
It's on the
No, we can't. So we might go to someone else and then come back and see if that connection has been repaired. Mr. Arasa?
Yes.
I know you spoke earlier, so but you're speaking in this context as well.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Yes, my name is Guy Arasa. I'm an Oromo from Ethiopia. I live here in Melbourne. I've made Australia my home after fleeing a long series of persecutions in Ethiopia. I'm a co-founder and public secretary of Jirra Permanent Humanitarian Fund for Oromos, a non-profit humanitarian association providing humanitarian assistance to Oromos affected by war, displacement, and persecution. In this hearing, I speak to some of the aspects of the problems Oromos face at home and how that affects Oromos here and our communities here. You have heard already from the past presentation that Ethiopia is in multiple set of crises, in the midst of multiple crises, political, security, human rights, and humanitarian. It is submerged by a genocidal war that has devastating consequences for our peoples in Oromia, in Benishangul Gumuz, Gambella, Tigray, and elsewhere. Oromia at this point in time is engulfed by a prolonged war for the last 3 years, a war that is less reported about, but as brutal and genocidal as the war unfolding in Tigray. The war started when Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister, launched a sustained military operation to eradicate the Oromo Liberation Army in 2019. Initially, the war led to a permanent state of emergency in Wallagga, Borana, and Guji zones, but later expanded to engulf the entire nation, fueled by social militarization that the Prime Minister encouraged and valorized immediately on assuming power. Oromia was beset by the following major tragedies. First is the political assassination of prominent Oromo personalities, including artist Hachalu Hundessa. The second is the mass incarceration of many young people, the Oromo Qeerroo and Qarree, who have been at the forefront of the protest movement that spanned from 2015 up until 2018. And there is extrajudicial murder of young people and putting on a spectacle of execution to help terrorize and humiliate people into submission. Emmanuel Wandumu is a young man who was so executed in Dambidolo recently. There is arbitrary arrest and detention of prominent Oromo political leaders such as Jawar Mohammed, Baqqala Garba, Abdi Raggasa, Batte Urgeessa, Lammi Benya, and a number of others. There is also this consistent attack on Oromo media outlets, including the Oromia Media Network, the media seen by many Oromos as their public voice. In the military operations conducted in Borana, in Guji and Wallagga, houses have been razed and huts have been burned on people. Harvests have been burnt on farms, and communications and bank services have been disrupted. There is a pattern of using rape of women and young male children as a weapon of war, and again, intended to humiliate and terrorize our people into submission. 6, there is extrajudicial expropriation of businesses, houses, properties, and destruction and looting of properties by the security forces in the conflict areas. And there is also the keeping of political leaders in house arrest, such as the Secretary General of the Oromo Liberation Front, Daud Ibsa, who has been in house arrest for a long time now, and misappropriating of their office properties and political party documents. At this point in time, there is famine going on in various zones in Oromia, in particular in Guji, Borana, and Qarree and Arsi, some of it fabricated by the government, some of it because of the ecological fragility of the surrounding. And so our problems are too many. and there is displacement. Mr. Chair, the list of issues we can raise in this meeting is rather long. On behalf of JIRA, however, I am sending a longer and more comprehensive statement by way of submission tonight or tomorrow morning. The statement will provide details of the humanitarian, and security costs of the war and the destructions unleashed in Oromia. At this point, I will limit only to myself only to the context. The cause of the war, both in Oromia and in Tigray, is primarily a political difference, the desire to suppress that difference by eliminating the people who embody and represent that difference. In the context of Oromia, the Oromo Liberation Army, the Oromo Liberation Front. A difference on the future direction of the country is also a part of the problem. As you know, the question for Oromos was, will Oromos enjoy genuine self-rule within the federal framework? And will they then exercise their constitutional right to self-determination? Or will they be subjected to another experiment to centralize power and repress expression of cultural difference and distinct identities? Unlike what many people assume, and the commentators earlier in the Tigray hearing session have pointed out, the prime minister of this genocidal regime, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, is not a reformist leading the way to a democratic future. He is a restorationist in my view, of the old imperial order, insisting on, quote unquote, making Ethiopia great again. Contrary to what he claims, he is not the new leader up against the old regime, the old political dispensation. And he is actually, he is part of the old EPRDF order, refusing the reform sought by the public and taking the country to a much older political dispensation of the imperial times. The Prime Minister's statements on several occasions indicated that his political mission is to save Ethiopia from Oromos. He reinforces the long-held Ethiopianist view that Oromos and the others of the Ethiopian state are a national security threat. The Prime Minister is wrongly lauded as a Nobel Peace Laureate because he, quote unquote, resolved the stalemate with Eritrea, when in fact his agreement with Eritrea was a secret war pact to form an alliance against Tigray and Oromia. To date, the content of the peace deal with Eritrea is unknown. In fact, what is happening on the ground today, the genocidal wars he is conducting in Oromia and Tigray, are a testament to how erroneous that judgment of the Nobel Committee was. Also, contrary to the claims he made when he launched the military operations in Oromia and declared a state of emergency there, he is not for law enforcement. In fact, he violated the constitution, postponed the constitutionally scheduled election, arrested all the Oromo political leaders, staged political show trials, and violently repressed constitutional demands of the Sidama, the Walaita, the Gedio, the Kamant, the Agao, and of course, the Oromo. In the last few days alone, after declaring a nationwide state of emergency, he has launched a renewed mass arrest of Oromo and Tigrayan civilians, Oromo young people to be forcefully conscripted for war efforts in Tigray. The impact, I will quickly rush through the impact. Of course, the devastating impact on the people at home is obvious, but the devastating impact on our people, our communities here, is even shocking. This war on Tigray and on Oromia has a devastating consequence, not just for the people at home, but also for their compatriots here. The Oromos and the Tigrayans here live with the onerous psychological, financial, and social burdens that have disrupted their lives on many levels, be it at home, in schools, in their workplaces, and in their businesses. Psychologically and emotionally, the pain and trauma of loss of loved ones and the consequent mental health problems, including suicidal urges, are palpable. Financially, the burden of raising funds to support their compatriots in the absence of humanitarian aid that's blocked by the regime is way too much for individuals to bear. Community members have had to sell their houses and businesses and spend their lifetime savings. So often, the less fortunate members had to slice their Centrelink benefits to send most of it to their loved ones at home. The war is taking a toll on their performance in workplaces, in schools. The war is taking a toll. It affects their working hours as they are too busy organizing fundraising or protests or organizing protests to advocate and speak out for the people, or to support those whose lives are in tatters because of the loss of immediate family members. And socially, their children bear the burden of attentive parents. I myself am a parent, a single father to a son. Parents preoccupied with endless series of meetings, protest rallies, and fundraising campaigns, etc. Needless to say, it takes an egregious toll on all of us here. And the recommendations we submit are very much parallel with what the group on Tigray was submitting earlier on. In our case, we would like Australia to help us bring peace and relief to our peoples, and to do so as a responsible international citizen, playing its role. And we submit the following to this committee for consideration. First, for Australia to discuss, for this committee to discuss the matter and take it to the parliamentary floor and pass a resolution that publicly condemns the ongoing genocidal war and the mass atrocity crimes thereof. And second, to put a diplomatic pressure on the regime using bilateral and multilateral sites of engagement to stop the war and start seeking a negotiated settlement, to decriminalize its adversaries and lift the proscription of OLA, OLF, and TDF as terrorist organizations, to allow unfettered access to humanitarian aid, to release all political prisoners and detainees kept in known and unknown detention centers, to conduct an international investigation of the crimes in Guji, Borana, Wolaga, and everywhere else, because these have been documented by Human Rights Watch and various other international human rights institutions, so that perpetrators of atrocious crimes such as genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, crimes against humanity are all held accountable. And thirdly, we would like Australia to join other international initiatives, for example, the ones by the US and the EU and the United Nations, to find a solution to the multifaceted problems in Ethiopia, to stop hostilities and end the war, to offer humanitarian assistance, to assist in making perpetrators accountable for atrocities, helping in setting up a special prosecution for designing, managing, and executing a transitional justice program, to help in reconstruction of the economy and transformation of the relations among survivors of this war. Apart from what Australia does and ought to do on the international plane, we believe that domestically here in Australia, Australia ought to pay attention to the specific needs of the Oromo communities here. In particular, we would like the Parliament to alert and direct government departments such as the DHS to these specific impacts of war, trauma, and mental health needs, mental health challenges, as they make services available for members of these communities. And finally, we would like this committee to consider strengthening the support system for their businesses, finances, families, and mental health needs. I thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Truman or Mr. Kufi?
Marima, do you mind if I go ahead? Thank you very much. Amhara hegemony over Ethiopia's peoples ended in 1991, only to be followed by 27 years of abuse and violence under the TPLF. Thousands were killed when Kero, the Oromo pro-democracy youth movement, brought the regime to an end in 2018 by organized peaceful protests. The TPLF withdrew to Tigray and the OLF returned to Ethiopia. But as we've seen, Amhara, Tigrayan racist hatred has again caused war and man-made famine. Not only in Tigray, that war began 1 year ago. The war against Kero, which enabled Abiy's ascent to power, and the war against all Oromo political opposition began 3 years ago. Abiy Ahmed is killing Oromo 3 times as fast as the TPLF did. Teenagers are shot in their homes, on their farms, on the street, in the bush, in public executions, or taken from prison and just shot dead. Military command posts are given awards for high kill rates. Amhara regional militia are committing ethnic cleansing on all borders of Amhara region. But biased media claim that each of the 4 neighboring peoples are committing genocide against them. To end this cycle of conflict and man-made famine, we must end zero-sum, winner-takes-all ethnic politics in Ethiopia. We must break this mold and establish a democracy which truly and fairly represents all the peoples. A dialogue which is planned, designed by, agreed by, and conducted by all the peoples of Ethiopia is needed. I noticed that the first session mentioned negotiations instigated by the African Union between the belligerents in the north, the ones who keep getting us into this mess. The oppressed, that is the majority peoples of Ethiopia, were hardly mentioned at all in the first session. Yet the majority peoples are the solution. Oromo youth brought about the democratic opportunity in 2018. Oromo have an ancient tradition of tolerance, inclusivity, democracy, and conflict resolution. Oromo are the glue, the connective tissue of Ethiopia. The Oromo are in every region, and all peoples live in peace in Oromia region. The Oromo, as the second largest people in Africa and the other oppressed people of Ethiopia, must be an integral part of its remolding and rebuilding. Otherwise, it will be doomed to fail. The dialogue must be owned by the peoples of Ethiopia, not the belligerents in the north. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Dinker or Ms. Barayu?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, Mrs. Dinker, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Lensa, and I'm a member of Oromo Women's Association Australia, in short, OWA. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and land on which we virtually meet. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to thank the organizing committee for this inquiry, in creating opportunity to get insight into Ethiopian politics climate and the impact it continues to leave on diaspora, and your time is invaluable. OWA first established in 2016 with the primary purpose of building Oromo female-driven leadership capacity within our community. Since then, the evolving circumstances in Ethiopia, particularly within Oromia, has altered OWA's agenda. Alongside OSGA, who invest in human rights awareness for the last 3 years, energy has now shifted into advocating for the Oromo women back home who face unspeakable forms of oppression by government military force. Oromia had embroiled into conflict only a few months after the current Ethiopian regime ascended to power in 2018 with the promise to transition the country into democracy. Hundreds of thousands were killed and displaced, women and children were raped, and houses were destroyed by Ethiopian military force over the last 3 years by the name of command post and a state of emergency. And this still happens as we speak, but lacks media coverage. Over the last few months, OWA has been in contact with Oromo women from various locations in Oromia, and to preserve confidentiality, their names won't be disclosed. Tangible information suggests there are many centers hidden away, with some even discussed as business centers or military camps operating to arm their subjects. One of these being 6 Kilo, which is observed by locals as an equipment warehouse. These women are innocent, everyday people who are accused of being members of an Oromo political party, example, Oromo Liberation Front. And some of the conditions they endure as follows. All denied medical treatment and exhibit visible physical signs of abuse, including electric shocks and whipping. Unable to sleep or sit, lots of them sleep in a kneeling position for 24 hours. When our source described one condition of one woman, they said, "She does not talk, just look at you." I can imagine the impact on her psychological status. A significant number have had their reproductive organs damaged and have claimed that is the target of torture. Further, when Abiy Ahmed took power in 2018, he publicly declared that he would have closed Maekelawi, the biggest prison in capital. 3 years on, prisons and detention centers have multiplied across the country, with almost all containing Oromo political leaders who were unlawfully detained for their distinguished policies that considers the self-determination of the Oromo people. According to human rights observers, at least 50% of prisoners in Ethiopia are Oromo descent. I want to stress what a lot of people don't know or tend to forget is that mistreatment and oppression have been consistent themes in Ethiopia and has predominantly been the first-hand experience of the Oromo under this regime and its ancestors. While the atrocities in Ethiopia Tigray region continue to escalate, sadly, it is nothing new to the country that never been embraced unity. That being one inclusive of all nations and nationalities residing with its borders. It's evident what we know is the devastating circumstances in Oromia since 2018 are mirrored in Tigray. With loved ones back home, we can't help but feel a great sense of helplessness, sadness, and guilt. We are physically here, but our thoughts are mentally there. We cannot be at peace while our families and friends' safety are at high risk. We are calling for your help, or on Australia, to exercise diplomatic pressure on Ethiopian regime to release all political prisoners, including women, without any delay or preconditions, and condemn the ethnic cleansing action of the government. And to encourage and support dialogue between political forces representing the interest of different national groups in the country that must be encouraged and facilitated without further delay. This includes the current regime to sit in dialogue, but not to facilitate. And to advocate for Australia, to advocate for Oromo organizations or institutes, such as Oromo Liberation Front, OLF, the Oromo Liberation Army, OLA, or Oromo Federalist Congress, OFC, and the Oromo Youth Organization, ERO, to be part of the peace dialogue. It is their demonstrations and sacrifice that created the political space for the 2018 reforms. Thank you.
Thank you. And can I see if Ms. Lazati is now back online?
Yes, I am. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can now. Would you like to make a few comments?
Wonderful. I'll be very brief. Thank you. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who have cared for this land since time immemorial. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and commit to a future with reconciliation at its heart. Thank you for having invited Diaspora Action Australia, DAA, to participate in this hearing. DAA has been supporting Ethiopian communities advocacy for many years by providing capability and capacity building, as well as fostering networking opportunities. We rejoiced with communities when in 2018, Ethiopia was about to embark on a new journey that promised dialogue among different ethnic groups, mutual respect, and peace. However, the last few years, and particularly after the start of the conflict in Tigray, communities have been reporting about the resurgence of violence and conflict within Ethiopia. The initial interest shown on Tigray by the international community and the media indirectly supported diaspora advocacy. However, it took an enormous amount of work, time, and effort to get the Australian government to recognize that the conflict and violence seen in Tigray spread far beyond the region's borders. During this time, DA's main objective was to ensure that communities' voices were heard. Our work revolved around supporting communities' lobbying, supplying resources, advising on strategy, and securing meeting with de facto members of opposition. By maintaining a neutral stand throughout our engagement, we were able to work with different ethnic groups, each possessing a highly diversified set of experiences, views, and opinions, all equally valuable. The ethnic composition and inter-community relationship of the Ethiopian diaspora are highly complex. Thus, by remaining neutral, we were able to piece together the different voices we heard and obtain a clear and rich picture of the situation in Ethiopia. The reports we heard spoke of similar events occurring across the country, such as people forced to stop farming, indiscriminate arrest, and brutal gender-based violence. Communities all agree that if the situation were to continue, the country could possibly collapse. In the 2017 Foreign Affairs White Paper, diasporas are listed as one of Australia's foreign policy partners, recognizing, among other things, that they have the knowledge and networks to help improve our understanding of development and humanitarian issues in other countries. And undoubtedly, the Ethiopian communities we supported have shown an unparalleled and unique understanding of the situation as it unfolded, thanks to their deep knowledge of the complex history and political landscape. It's this knowledge, coupled with strong transnational networks, that also renders diaspora communities instrumental to deliver humanitarian assistance, ensuring aid reaches those who are most in need. The FAT and the Australian government are fortunate to have these communities here. They're a valuable resource to partner with. I would like to conclude by thanking you for providing a critical opportunity for diaspora voices to be heard, and I strongly encourage you to heed the advice of the Ethiopian diaspora communities to address the countrywide ongoing crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Lazati. We will go to some questions and discussion, and the Deputy Chair, Mr. Hayes, will lead off.
Well, thank you very much for your contributions. And I think what has come clear through your written submissions as well as your presentations today, the level of the humanitarian crisis that has occurred there is probably up with what we saw in Syria. In terms of, we thought that was probably the worst humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. I think what's occurring in Ethiopia now is probably starting to actually meet that level of balance in terms of the level of humanitarian crisis. But I wanted to go to just a question, and I think you've all made it very clear that the Omarians, their voice must be heard in any peace process. But I wanted to go to Dr. Trueman in this and ask him how would that simply occur, whereas at the moment it doesn't seem that the Omarians have been, or it does seem that they've been excluded, their voice has been excluded in much of the settlement processes or peace process, the discussions that have occurred. But how, in terms of their sizable presence in certainly a fair part of the geography of Ethiopia, but nevertheless, how would the international community play a role in ensuring the voice of the Omarian people in the peace process in Ethiopia?
Thank you very much. You're absolutely correct. The Oromo have had a very low profile internationally, and that is because the people from Ethiopia with most experience and connections with the media in the West are Amhara. And all of these people have grown up, like the British did in the 1950s, believing that the people in their colonies were inferior to them. And growing up in this milieu, the Amhara mentality is similar to that of the British back in the 40s and 50s. And unfortunately, this is mirrored by the way the West sees Ethiopia. We see Ethiopia as mirrored in Amhara culture, the Amhara language, Amhara script, Amhara calendar, Amhara religion. And this is equated with Ethiopia. All the other peoples of Ethiopia, apart from those in the north, have been forgotten. And this is applied for over a century now. What Australia can do is amplify the voice of its constituents, the people who belong to the oppressed majorities of Ethiopia, and just amplify their voices and try and counter the effect of the Amhara stranglehold over the media. In terms of the negotiations, I believe any sort of foreign affairs office will have an input, and I think it's important to stress the importance of changing the mold of Ethiopian politics so that we stop this stranglehold of one group over all the others in Ethiopia. In 1991, we just swapped one hegemonic power for another. And it looks as though Abiy Ahmed is trying to go us back to where we were before 1991. This must be stopped. That experiment has failed over and over again. We must hear the oppressed majority peoples of Ethiopia rather than the northern belligerents. Sorry, I've gone into rant mode.
Thank you.
Mr. Hill.
Thank you. I think we've covered a lot of the issues in both the comments and the previous questions. So, in essence, you're suggesting, and the other submitters, that we can amplify the voices of Australians. I think that's entirely appropriate. The thing I'm always searching for in these discussions is there anything we can do that is of particular practical effect beyond calling for things, given our influence is limited? Is there anything else that you think the Australian government can or should be doing that you haven't already mentioned or that hasn't been mentioned in the previous session, because we're just about out of time? Just want to make sure that we've had the opportunity to put that on record, because I haven't seen any written submissions as yet.
Anybody like to answer, Mr. Hill?
You don't need to repeat what's already been said. I just want to, it's really a safety net question. Is there any other action that we haven't put on the table or the record yet?
If I may, there's one thing that as Diaspora Action Australia, we've always been, Miss Lorenza Lazzati here from Diaspora Action Australia. One thing we've always been advocating for, many diaspora communities have their own organization, and some of them are capable of providing relief, providing humanitarian assistance and development. So one thing that could potentially be done is to kind of create supporting channels, financial support to this community, and work with them to deliver humanitarian assistance. We are aware that the aid to Africa, Australia's aid to Africa, it's quite limited. It's not particularly big. There's a small budget for that. And there are community funds that are being, community schemes that are available through the overseas missions. I have already engaged with the Australian Embassy in Addis, but the grants that are available are in around $20,000, which you can imagine is very limited given the proportion and the size of the crisis. So one thing that I think it would actually be quite useful is to consider to have a particularly set schemes to support relief. And I mean, I know the Oromo have their own relief organization. They originally started in UK in the 1980s. There is a branch here in Australia. Same as for the Tigrayans, they also have their own relief. And it's something that many diaspora communities do to help their own community of reference, whether it's in country of heritage or in other host countries.
Okay, thank you. And just final question to the diaspora community groups. How often do you meet with DFAT, and when did you last meet with the Foreign Minister?
May I?
Thanks.
Yeah. In April 2021, we had been to Canberra to meet with a group of experts on the Africa desk of the Foreign Office.
Terrific.
We had a conversation more or less similar to this one, and we had written a letter before we went there, and we had that discussion. And before that, in 2019, also we had a similar meeting with them. In 2019, we appeared before this committee, and then when we went out of the Parliament House, we went to the DFAT to meet with, again, the Undersecretary for Africa, and we have briefed them about the situation that then was prevalent, which was a massive displacement of peoples, about 1.3 people displaced from the Somali border region. And we were also already indicating the fact that Abiy Ahmed's regime is not the democratic reformist that the world is hailing him as. He has already been imprisoning many of our political leaders, closing down on our media outlets, and in fact,
sorry, in the interest of time, we've gone over this, and I didn't ask what did you discuss. I asked when did you meet.
If I can.
Yeah, has anyone met with the Foreign Minister?
Yeah, as a woman, thank you. My name is Lensa again, from Women. So as a Oromian Women Association in Australia, we have a close contact with DFAT through DAA. Last we met was middle of September, so we had a good communication. We have open channel. They're happy to listen to us, and we moving forward with DFAT. We mentioned all what we mentioned here, and also we share press release every now and then.
Great. No, that's really good to hear.
Excuse me, I also would like to add another thing. We had another meeting as well in November after, because we were hoping for the release of the independent report by the UN and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. So we had a second round of meetings in early November. But in terms of meeting the minister, I have been trying to broker meetings between the minister office and communities for the past year and a half, and I never received an answer from the office.
Oh, so they haven't got back to you at all?
No.
So no one's met with the minister? Because there was no one from the Tigrayan groups that have met with the minister.
Yeah.
Mr. Kufi?
No.
Good. All right, thank you.
Senator Rice.
Thank you. And I know we're very short on time, so I've got two questions. One which should be quick, which was a clarification question to Ms. Dinka. And when you talked of the horrific circumstances of the women in the prisons, I just wanted to know what the extent of the prison population and of Oromo people in prisons. How many people have been arrested and are there in the prisons under the sorts of conditions that you are outlining?
Yeah, thank you. I would like Dr. Trevor to answer this question because he's more involved with prisoners. I'm more closely watching the women's issues. So I know the devastating issues on the women, but Dr. Trevor, please, if you.
Okay, thank you, Lensa. It's very difficult, and it's all estimates and compared to previous estimates. But my estimate is that it's over 100,000 people are in detention in Oromia region, possibly double that number, but certainly 100,000. And a proportion of those will be women. It won't be the majority, but a proportion will be over 10%.
Okay.
And that, when I've interviewed women who've been in detention in Ethiopia, at least 50% have been raped, usually on multiple occasions by multiple perpetrators.
That's just so horrific. Okay, and then look, my second and last question was to Ms. Lazati, and who I know, Ms. Lazati, you do a lot of work with different communities. I wanted to know how you go with dealing with the varying narratives. For example, I mean, the committee have received a letter from one community organisation here in Australia that has been very supportive of the current Ethiopian government.
Thank you for that question. As I said in my statement, DA retains a neutral stand whenever we're dealing with communities because we understand that there are conflicting views. And we have also been approached by communities who was very supportive of the government. What we maintain it's important to do in this kind of situation is to, as much as possible, be unbiased and trying to listen to everyone. And as I said, by getting all the different views, you will find that there are commonalities. I've worked a lot with some of the Tigrayans that were on the call before, and I work with a lot with the Oromo groups that are here at the moment. And if you listen to their stories, you realize that the sort of abuses that have been perpetrated, the sort of type of the tortures and so on, they're all the same. But then they are telling you that one has happened in Tigray, in the Tigray region, the other one might have happened in Western Oromia or Southern Oromia. So there's some kind of commonalities within that. And they all have, when you listen carefully to what they say, they all have one point in mind, and that is to bring peace to their country. And so what form that whatever shape that dialogue is going to take, it does need everyone to sit at the table and mediate the various views. I hope these answer your question.
Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Lozato.
Ms. Van Batten-Mao?
Fine. I'll be fine. Thank you.
Right. And Mr. Khalil, if you have any questions? If not, can I thank all the participants who've participated in this second session today. You'll each be sent a copy of the transcript when it becomes available.
Mr. Chair, can I just clarify one point?
Yes, quickly, Mr.
Yes, the meetings I had with the DFAT and this committee was as part of the Australian Oromo Community Association of Victoria. Back then, JIRA wasn't established, so I just wanted to make sure that that's clear. We also had a meeting with Minister Julie Bishop in 2016, 2017, again, on behalf of the Australian Oromo Community Association of Victoria, not on behalf of JIRA. I just wanted to clarify.
That's right. Thank you for that clarification. As I was saying, you'll all be sent a copy of the transcript, and if there are any corrections that you wish to make, then you'll be able to send them back to the Secretariat. And if there's any further information that you wish to provide, could you provide it to the Secretariat by the 18th of November 2021? Thank you all once again for your participation. We appreciate it very much, and we'll suspend for a couple of minutes while we change over from this session to the final session with the officials from DFAT.
Thank you.
Very much.
Can I now welcome the officials from DFAT for this final session? Can I ask you to identify yourself by name and position, please?
Mark Innes-Brown, First Assistant Secretary, Middle East and Africa Division.
Good afternoon. Alison Charters, Assistant Secretary, Africa Branch.
And Lynn Bell, Assistant Secretary, Crisis Preparedness and Management Branch.
Thank you very much. Thank you for appearing today. I'll refer to the usual warning that I give. I think you've probably heard it more times than I've said it, so I think we probably all understand that about giving opinions on matters of policy. Can I invite you to make some opening statements?
Sure, thank you very much. I'd like to deliver an opening statement. The Australian government remains gravely concerned about the conflict in northern Ethiopia, which is now, as you know, entering its second year. The conflict is spreading and it has the potential to not only threaten the stability of Ethiopia, but also the broader Horn of Africa region. While the situation in the Tigray region has received recent media attention, we're also concerned about unrest in other areas in the country, including Amhara, Afar, Benishangul Gumuz and the Oromia regions of the country. The joint investigation report by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, which was released last week on the 3rd of November, highlights serious abuses and violations of human rights, international humanitarian law and international refugee law committed by all parties to the conflict in the Tigray region. Examples of this include unlawful or extrajudicial killings and executions, systematic sexual and gender-based violence, torture and other forms of ill treatment, arbitrary detention, and abductions and enforced disappearances. Australia has consistently called for all perpetrators of human rights abuses to be held to account for their actions and for survivors to be supported. The humanitarian situation in northern Ethiopia, where an estimated 7 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, is dire and continues to deteriorate. The recent escalation of violence, including the Ethiopian government's decision to launch a major air and ground offensive in October, continues to limit the ability of the international community to deliver much needed assistance. It is reprehensible in the context of such need that parties to the conflict continue to actively prevent humanitarian assistance from reaching people in significant need. It's essential the United Nations and other humanitarian actors be unfettered in their ability to work to alleviate the suffering caused by this conflict. We also condemn the killing of 23 humanitarian workers since the conflict began. Australia is providing humanitarian support in Ethiopia to help the most vulnerable. We provided $3 million to the World Food Programme in March to provide urgently needed food supplies to those facing the gravest food insecurity. Australia has provided a further $3 million to the International Committee of the Red Cross to reinforce critical health and medical services, support survivors of sexual violence, and address essential needs of the most vulnerable. Additionally, we have deployed humanitarian specialists to several UN organisations under the Australia Assist program. This is in addition to support we provide each year to the UN and other international organisations in core funding for humanitarian action. Foreign Minister Payne and Australian officials have repeatedly called on all parties to the conflict to end hostilities and allow immediate, unimpeded access for humanitarian agencies to reach those in need of food and other support. Throughout the conflict, we've expressed Australia's concerns directly with the Ethiopian government and through multilateral avenues, including the United Nations Human Rights Council and the United Nations Security Council. We will continue to make Australia's concerns heard. We are acutely aware of the distress the conflict in northern Ethiopia and the increasing instability in other parts of the country is causing members of the Ethiopian diaspora in Australia. Many Australians have close ties to Ethiopia, and we extend our deepest sympathies to those who have friends and family affected by the conflict. Officers from the department have been active in engagement with the diaspora community, including conducting a dozen meetings this year with community representatives, as well as responding to their correspondence. We appreciate their information and advocacy and the opportunity to keep them updated on the Australian government response to the conflict in Ethiopia. Australia remains committed to supporting a peaceful resolution of this crisis. The trajectory of the conflict to date highlights there can be no winners, only a prolonging of the suffering of millions of people. As such, we repeat our calls for all sides to immediately end hostilities and urge all actors in this conflict to work with the African Union's High Representative for the Horn of Africa to reach a mediated solution. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Ellis-Brown. If I can lead off then. We heard in the first session today, in answer to the question, which country around the world has the most influence in terms of trying to bring about some resolution of this conflict, to which the answer was the United States of America and maybe to a lesser extent Kenya as a neighbouring country. What essentially is the roadblock? Is it just a lack of cooperation in terms of the Ethiopian government and other parties in Ethiopia to want to involve themselves in some resolution of this conflict, or what do you see it as?
Thank you very much. I think there's a range of complex political and historical factors that have led to this situation. In terms of, the US is obviously an influential player. In recent days, their Special Representative Feldman has been in Addis Ababa. Our embassy hopefully will be getting a readout on that, on what progress, if any, was made during those discussions later today. We also see the African Union, I think, is an important player as well, and their Special Representative, former President Obasanjo from Nigeria, has also been in Addis in recent days, and soundings that we've had from the Nigerian embassy there suggests that, there might be some positive signs, but it remains to be seen. We haven't seen a lot of willingness from either of the major actors in this conflict to lay down their arms and, return to the negotiation table, unfortunately, at this stage.
And what are the likely best levers? I mean, if talk is not working, is there something else that might?
Well, at this stage, appealing to the key parties in the conflict, and there's been a lot of liaison with the Ethiopian government, as I said, in recent days, to try and to encourage them to step back from the pursuit of military action, which they embarked on in a renewed sense in late October. I think it's too early to tell whether that will work. Other than that, I think my general sense of the international community is that making representations at the moment is to appeal to people, key players, about the need to cease fighting and find a peaceful solution is about the best way forward. And that's I think that's the vehicle or the methodology that's being pursued at the moment. And there hasn't been any discussion of other particular measures at this time that I'm aware of.
Mr. Hayes?
Well, thank you very much. And you probably have detected from the last presenters, and by the way, the ones before that, I think DFAT really got a pretty clean bill of health, actually. They actually went to some efforts to say the level of cooperation in listening to them and being constructive. So I thought, from behalf of us, I think, thanks for the job you do. It just seems to us also from the presentations that have been made, but also the submissions that they've all previously submitted, is that there's probably no one operating this conflict with clean hands, particularly when it comes to issues of crimes against humanity and war crimes. So I think whether it's against the Eritrea refugees or others, it does seem that this is simply widespread. You've referred to the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission report conducted in conjunction with the UNHCR. I understand there was some criticism of that report. Bear in mind there's from the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, some suggestion, well, they're actually appointed by the Ethiopian government, but we also understand that the Amnesty International is currently evaluating that, which will give us a copy of their evaluation. But it does seem that they have at least specified the amount of crimes against humanity that has occurred and detailed the form that's been in, which is, I guess, so from my perspective, pretty horrific. Just what they've reported on. Look, and I know it's been asked of a number of the presenters, well, what do you think Australia can do other than simply exercising our voice about calling for restraint in these matters? But I'm just wondering, is there anything else we do? Bear in mind we've just come through a view about having targeted sanctions, but I'm not sure whether that would apply. I don't think there's much Ethiopian investment in this country by corporations or individuals, so I'm not sure that would be one of those things that would be being looked at. But are there other things that we can do to exercise our concern in relation to these hostilities?
Sure. Thank you very much. Yes, the report that was put out by the joint report, investigative report, I think it was, I mean, there were concerns about, people have raised concerns about its partiality, before it came out, partiality and some limitations on the scope of the investigation, including the time frame and access to witnesses and stuff. But having read it, it documents in pretty gruesome detail a wide range of abuses by all parties of the conflict. So I think it's very clear that there's been terrible conduct by all parties and so on. I guess the next step, though, is implementation. I mean, there's a range of steps, and the Ethiopian government has made some statements about, for their part, taking forward investigations of people from their forces and prosecuting them. We'll obviously have to wait and see whether that happens, and I think the international community will be watching to see whether those particular recommendations are actually taken forward and implemented in practice. On the other hand, a couple of the other key parties, including the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and the Eritrean government, haven't made any similar statements. So we'll just have to see whether they do in coming days. In terms of what more we can do, I think at this stage, I mean, I think our best course of action is to continue to support, in concert with other major players and in fora such as the Human Rights Council, to try and implore the Ethiopian government and other parties this conflict to cease what they're doing and also to take action on these human rights abuses. You mentioned targeted sanctions, not something we're currently considering. As you know, the government's currently reviewing autonomous sanctions legislation, so it's not something we consider. I think the passage of that taking forward the general reforms in that area, I think we'll await those and then and before taking further action. But as I said, I'm not at this stage. I'm not aware of any specific new initiatives by key countries to go down the sanctions path, but I'm not. That may happen down the track, particularly if this report is not the spirit of this report is not conformed with. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you. You spoke of the representations that we've been making to the Ethiopian government. Can you give me a bit more detail of exactly what we have been asking of them and when, what are those what the details of those representations when they've occurred?
Sure. So there's been a number at officials level, and the Foreign Minister, of course, has made some public statements, but about it. And most recently, the Foreign Minister, 20th of October, put out a statement in response to airstrikes in Mekelle and Tigray.
I think we've got that one.
Yeah, we've also joined the statement with a range of other countries in response to the investigative report, which is on the Foreign Minister's website. More recently, we have raised concerns. I'll divide it up by what we've done here in Canberra and what we've done in Addis. On the 21st of October, on the 16th and the 8th of September, our ambassador raised concerns about the conflict and humanitarian access with senior officials of the Ethiopian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Addis. Prior to that, on the 2nd of August, the 29th of June and the 17th of June, our former Chargé d'Affaires similarly raised concerns with the Ethiopian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Here in Canberra, on the 23rd of September, 28th of July and the 29th of June, myself and Ms. Charters variously raised our concerns with the Ethiopian ambassador, and there are concerns about the violence, about human rights abuses, about humanitarian access. Those, the sorts of issues that have been covered off, we've had to raised on numerous occasions.
Okay, how about the most recent, the declaration of the state of emergency?
We haven't issued a specific statement on that particular development.
I presume that's of considerable concern.
It is. There are a range of concerns, and we've, as I said, we've raised concerns about the human rights situation, about humanitarian access. We've called upon the Ethiopian government, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, to end hostilities and reach a negotiated solution. So they're the key. Thus far, that's been the key focus of our public statements.
How much aid have we given? And through, you mentioned through the World Food Programme and Red Cross.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
How much aid in, over, say, the last, or particularly over the last year?
$6 million this year.
Right. And has that all gone through the World Food Programme and Red Cross?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Has there been any consideration or work that you've done working with diaspora communities to be delivering aid through their relief programs?
Not that I'm aware of, Senator, but certainly something we can take on notice and talk to our humanitarian division about. Do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to add, Alison Charters, Assistant Secretary, Africa Branch. Yes, and I think it's been raised by some of the diaspora groups this afternoon. We, of course, through our embassy also have a small grants program, which is available for community groups to apply for in the country for work in particular sectors. Beyond the humanitarian support, we also have the Australian NGO Cooperation Program, so ANCP, so there's a number of Australian NGOs with local partners also delivering projects in Ethiopia as well. So just a couple of examples of further projects.
With the aid that's going through the World Food Programme and the Red Cross, what visibility have you got as to how much of it's actually getting through? In the evidence that was presented to us this afternoon, there were varying estimates of, only 5 or 10% of the aid actually getting to where it needs to go.
Sure. So yes, it's very difficult to get aid in generally, and the UN has been on the record about the difficulty of, the number of trucks that have been, that they've been able to get in over certain time periods and so forth. I'm advised that the World Food Programme, this is generally not just specifically our aid, but has started its last round of food distribution in late October, the 27th of October, and they've reached almost 40,000 people. And currently UN agencies, they do have supplies on the ground and are currently negotiating access. It sounds like it's quite difficult, but they're
40,000 people when we were told there's 5 or 7 million people that are currently at risk of starvation.
No, I agree, it's a very difficult situation. On the ICRC, they advised us yesterday that they are still able to deliver humanitarian assistance in northern Ethiopia, including in Tigray, they are able to retain. They are still able to deliver some supplies by road, and they're working through the Ethiopian Red Cross network to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. But it's a far from perfect situation.
Hence, if the diaspora communities have actually got the ability to get aid in through their networks, it seems to me to be a sensible way of at least thoroughly investigating that. Do we have any programs of military aid or military equipment going into Ethiopia?
We don't have any military aid on military equipment.
There may be some examples in the past of some equipment, but that would be a matter for the Department of Defence to speak to that issue. But certainly not aid and not a direct capacity building program. It's not.
Okay, and look, just then finally, we've already had the discussion about sort of the potential, the value and the potential of sanctions and, what those sanctions would look like and sort of what the level of trade currently is. Do you have any visibility of, again, that's, of trade, but also the visas? Because, we do have a big Ethiopian diaspora community here, and whether, in fact, the potential of sanctions in terms of visas would be powerful. And we were informed this afternoon that the US are potentially looking at a first instance of having sort of sanctions on visas.
Yeah, I'm not up to date with that particular US development, but at this stage we're not developing a set of sanctions arrangements. But if we were, that could be one area where we could look at.
Look, actually, I've got one more final question, which is in terms of the issues over the UNHCR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Report and the criticisms of that of not being independent, whether Australia is calling on the UN to actually have a more definitely independent, thorough investigation.
Not at this stage, Senator. We and others, we issued a statement a few days ago. We're calling on the Ethiopian government and other actors to take action, and I guess we'll be reviewing the situation as time goes on as to whether they actually take any action, and then speak to international partners if they don't about what options might be available, but not at this stage.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Hill. Thanks. If I could perhaps ask Ms. Bell a few questions, given your responsibilities, give you a little break, have some water. We're obviously searching for any sense of leverage or what we could do to avoid, use our influence to avoid further conflict. In the worst case, the worst analyses, which I think we've been receiving, is this is heading towards a civil war. The United States pulled their diplomats, or most of them, out in the last week or so. Britain's told all their citizens to leave the country. Have we had any Australian personnel leave the country as yet?
No, we haven't. We updated our travel advice for Ethiopia on Saturday. Sorry, I might remove this to speak. So we updated our travel advice for Ethiopia on Saturday, the 6th of November, lifting that to do not travel, which is the highest level that we have due to the ongoing civil unrest, conflicts in the north and the risk of them spreading to other parts of the country. So Australians are advised now not to travel to Ethiopia, and Australians in Ethiopia are asked to review their need to stay and to consider leaving if it's safe to do so on the existing commercial options. So the Australian government has decided to offer voluntary departures for dependents of Australian staff and non-essential staff from the Australian Embassy, and no one has yet taken that option.
How many staff do we have there?
We have 5 A-based staff and a number of dependents.
Staff. Yeah. Okay. Can you guarantee the safety and security of the Australian mission and those staff then?
Well, we are constantly reviewing the situation for Ethiopia. We are staying in very close touch with the mission. We have a do not travel advice for Ethiopia. And we are in regular touch with our staff in the mission.
Because there's a dissonance, if you like, between the Australian position as it's being outlined and what we've heard from the United States and Britain, and that, as you'd understand, may be a matter of concern to parliamentarians to understand why other major countries with a lot more power and backup than us are pulling their diplomats out, but at this stage...
Understood. Can I just clarify? I think they haven't pulled out all their staff.
They're leaving a skeleton staff. Yeah.
As I understand it, yeah, they've asked. It varies by country, and we're watching this. I should underline, we're watching this closely, and we're having constant discussions about the situation and our staffing posture and our operations. We are constantly monitoring and having including just before coming here, we were talking about it. But as I understand it, the American position was they pulled out. They offered initially a voluntary departure of dependents and non-essential staff.
It's not essential.
Yeah. So we have a very small footprint.
Yep.
And so we considered that the number of staff that we had, Australian staff, were essential. That was the judgment that we made. There was an offer made, and some staff and their families are still considering it. So the situation is evolving, and I think I understand the premise of your question. We are watching the situation closely and constantly thinking about it.
Has the Minister sought or received advice on this question?
Yes.
And what are Australia's business interests, as you understand them, and commercial interests in the event of a deterioration?
Do you want to answer that, Alison?
Thank you very much. Yes, our embassy in Addis Ababa is obviously in touch with some of the companies. There are some mining interests that Australia has in Ethiopia, and there's likely to be a few other sort of private sector interests. It's not large compared to some countries, of course, in the continent, but nevertheless, yes, we're seeking to maintain contact with Australian companies. Some of them, of course, just have local staff on the ground at this time. Some of them do have international staff, so we're tracking that closely with our team.
How many Australian citizens do we know of still in the country?
We are aware of 288. We're aware of 288 Australian citizens, permanent residents and immediate family members in Ethiopia. We've had about, our post in Addis has had about 60 consular calls from people touching base and including their family members, sort of covering about 110 people, those 60 calls. Not all callers have expressed interest in returning to Australia at this time, and we haven't, since the 2nd of November, had any calls to our Consular Emergency Centre here in Canberra.
Okay. I doubt that you'd know the answer to this, but I'll just explain the context, and I'm not sure whether you're able to seek advice from Home Affairs or whether we have to ask them, but I'm curious to understand how many partner visa or immediate family visa applications there are currently in the system for citizens of Ethiopia. The reason I ask this is a point that I've been ferociously critical of the government on. I think I called it lethal negligence, as people have died as a result of government policy, and the discrimination against processing visas of family members in Afghanistan. We finally got, after the cover-up that the government refused to answer questions, we got the questions through FOI and found that there's about 8,500 partner visa applications, children of Australian citizens, husbands, wives of Australians, that have been stuck for years in Afghanistan waiting for their visa to be processed. And the next most common area of concern for Home Affairs, just not processing visas, is people from Africa. So is that something that's been the subject of discussion in contingency planning? These are husbands, wives, children of Australians who are stuck there waiting for partner visas because they can't get a visitor visa to come to Australia.
I think we'll have to take that question on how many partner visas are outstanding on notice.
Sure, okay. That'd be terrific if you could seek that advice from Home Affairs. I suppose one of the learnings from Afghanistan, and put aside for a moment the political criticism, because it was deliberate government policy to leave those people there for years and not prioritise them. But the question I suppose I'm asking you more broadly as DFAT, in your crisis contingency planning for these kinds of situations, is that something we've thought about previously, or is it something that perhaps might be novel that we might want to think about building into our checklists and procedures of things if we've got the time to think about? Because many of these are Australian citizens by descent that may not have registered in effect.
Yep, we do in thinking about crisis preparedness, think about family units related to Australian citizens and permanent residents. Yep.
Right, if you could take that on notice, that'd be terrific, because that's obviously been an area of concern in other places. Just with regard to the sanctions question, what would be the considerations that you would take into account in forming a judgment as to the efficacy of sanctions?
Well, I think
I'm getting to efficacy because I understand you said that there's not currently a considerate.
Sure, I mean, we'd want to be convinced, I suppose, that it would. It's obviously a careful evaluation of whether they would be effective and what our actual interests are, and whether there would be sort of whether it could damage our interests in other areas would be evaluated. Obviously, we also take into account the practices or policy positions of others as well. So there's a sort of mix of factors that would inform our thinking about it. But we'd have to be hopeful that in doing so, a key consideration would be whether it would have some positive impact in one way or another.
Okay, so that might be the extent of commercial interests. Is that that sort of thing a factor?
Well, that would be a consideration, but there are a range of them. Yeah.
I think that's probably all. Oh, sorry, just in the same vein, Ms. Bell, final question, picking up on what Senator Rice asked as well, just regarding our aid interests and activities, have we got Australian citizens currently in Ethiopia undertaking aid projects?
I might just pass to Ms. Charters for
Sorry,
work on
wrong
aid.
person.
Is that all right? Thank you.
Thank you. It's one we may have to take on notice. We certainly had there was a discussion with Australian NGOs actually this morning on a range of issues, including, of course, Ethiopia. I can't give you a clear answer at the moment. I'm not aware of Australian side. Most of them are obviously being run through sort of local partners at this moment in time, but we would have to
It'd be good just to
clarify
take on
that.
notice, because they're often, we know from other conflicts, some of the more vulnerable people, given the nature of the work they do. And I suppose the final question to you, to the First Assistant Secretary, in considering the worst case scenario of things continuing to deteriorate, have we got contingency plans in place with our other agencies for a deterioration in circumstances?
Yeah, we're regularly talking now as the situation has deteriorated with agencies across government about the situation and contingency planning and measures and triggers and this sort of thing. It's part of our general. We do this as a matter of course when a situation, a country unravels, and we're doing that at the moment.
The only general question, Chair, which maybe might have been one to ask right at the start, but how would you explain to the committee, or how would we distill what you would see as Australia's national interests in Ethiopia and our key levers of influence?
Sure, thank you. Well, we have a general interest in the supporting Australians in Ethiopia, providing consular support. We have business interests, which you touched on before. We have a humanitarian interest. We are supporting a number of modest or small aid projects, but we're also providing humanitarian assistance. So there's obviously general humanitarian need. We are concerned about the security in the region. We wouldn't want the situation in Ethiopia to spill over into neighbouring countries and lead to a complete destabilisation of the region, which then could lead to a cascading of other sort of negative security impacts elsewhere. So in brief, that's how I would characterise it.
So that's the regional stability aspect. Is China a significant player?
China is involved in Ethiopia. It has provided a range, as I understand it, a range of development assistance. It has been active there. Built the headquarters of the African Union, which is based in Addis Ababa, their office premises. Has had, like in many African countries, it has been extensive involvement in the development assistance space, infrastructure development and the like.
Thanks, Chair.
Mr Innes-Brown, Ms Charters and Ms Bell, thank you very much for participating in this hearing today. We appreciate your contribution to it. You'll be sent the Hansard, obviously, and if there's any further matters that you can respond to, I would appreciate that by the 18th of November, if that's possible, please. And on that note, I will declare, I should thank the Secretariat, Parliamentary... Yes, certainly, Mr Innes-Brown.
I was asked about whether we'd said anything public about the state of emergency. I should note that it was highlighted in our most recent travel advisory change. So just want to get back to you on that.
Thank you for that.
Representations to the government about it.
No.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank the Secretariat, Parliamentary Broadcasting, and I declare this hearing adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.